The ground pushed back. Kai pressed the trowel in, and the earth resisted, cold, packed, still holding the memory of frost. He pulled the blade out, shifted 2 inches to the left, and tried again. Better. He turned the soil over, and it came up in a dark clump, releasing a smell that wasn't quite pleasant yet. Too wet, too raw, but that he'd learned to read over the years. Working soil. Not dead. He was kneeling on a piece of old cardboard, his worn jeans already damp at the knees anyway, his sneakers sinking slightly into the softened strip along the fence. The shelter's yard was small, 12 steps wide, maybe 20 long, and most of it was paving stones, cracked in places, with weeds pushing through the gaps. The garden beds ran along the south wall, 3 narrow rows that someone had built from salvaged timber back when the building still had a maintenance crew. Now it was just Kai, and Tuesday, and Friday mornings. He had come at 8. By 10, the first row was cleared. The old stems from last autumn pulled and piled. The soil turned twice and raked flat. He worked methodically, the way he did everything, without rushing, without pausing, without looking up much. There was a rhythm to it that his body had learned long before his head had found words for why it mattered. He was pulling a paper bag from his jacket pocket. Onion sets, small and dry, smelling faintly of last summer, when he heard sneakers on the paving stones. He didn't turn around. He placed 1 bulb, made a shallow hole with his thumb, covered it, placed another. The footsteps stopped maybe 3 meters behind him, and then went quiet. He kept working. "What is that?" The voice was small, direct, slightly raspy, the way children's voices get when they've been outside in the cold. "Onion," Kai said without turning. A pause. "Why? Going to eat it." Another pause, longer. He heard the crunch of gravel as she came a step closer. Then she sat down, not next to him exactly, at an angle where she could see his hands. She had braids tied with yellow and blue elastic bands, and a bandage wrapped around 1 knee. Her sneakers flashed a dim pink at the heel, the battery probably going flat. She was watching his hands with the serious attention of someone studying a card trick. He placed another bulb, covered it. From across the yard near the door, he registered movement at the edge of his vision. A figure that had come out and then stopped by the wall. He didn't look up, just noted it. Someone there. Standing, not coming closer. Tiny, he didn't know her name yet, would learn it from a staff member 2 days later. Picked up a loose clump of soil from the edge of the bed. She turned it over in her palm, set it down. He kept working. The figure by the wall didn't move. That was the thing you noticed most, later, when he thought about it. Not the small orc girl who'd walked up without asking permission, which was fine, which he'd had happen before with the shelter kids. But the older one, tall, dark jacket, standing against the brickwork with her arms crossed, who had come outside, seen what was happening, and stayed. She hadn't called the girl back. Hadn't walked over to intervene or explain or apologize for the intrusion, the way adults usually did. She had just planted herself by the wall and watched. He placed the last bulb in the row, patted the soil flat with 2 fingers. "Done?" Tiny asked. "1 row," he said. "2 more." She thought about that for a moment, then resettled herself cross-legged on the cold paving stones and waited. As if she had nowhere better to be. As if she'd decided to stay until the job was finished, and the decision was obvious, and didn't require comment. He opened the 2nd row with the trowel. Behind him, the figure by the wall hadn't moved. Kai worked. The cold came up through his knees, through the cardboard, through the worn, thin denim. He could hear the street beyond the fence, a bus somewhere, a dog. Inside the shelter, someone was moving things around on a floor above. The sounds of a building full of people who'd all arrived here the same way, by running out of options. He knew that sound. He'd lived inside it. He placed bulbs, covered them. He didn't try to make conversation, didn't explain himself or the planting or why he came on Tuesdays. He just worked, and the girl watched his hands, and somewhere behind him a woman stood against a brick wall in the cold and did not leave. There are things you don't do for reasons. You just do them because the ground is there and the seeds are in your pocket, and it's early enough in the spring that it's still possible. Some things don't need explaining. They just need doing. He covered the last bulb of the second row and straightened his back just slightly, just enough to feel where it was tight. Tiny had gone quiet in that particular way children go quiet when they've stopped being bored and started being absorbed. He reached into his pocket for the bag again. From the wall, nothing. No footsteps. No door. Still there. Kai came back on Friday. He had a small paper envelope in his jacket pocket. Pepper seeds. The kind you start indoors in early spring when the ground is still too cold, but you don't want to lose the season. He'd bought them from the same hardware store he always used, 2 stops off his courier route, 50 cents a packet. He'd bought 3. Tiny was already in the yard. She was standing by the garden bed when he came through the gate, hands in the front pocket of her tracksuit, shifting her weight from foot to foot, the way kids do when they've been waiting for something, but don't want to look like they've been waiting. The frog backpack was on her back, even though it was Saturday and there was nowhere she needed to go. When she saw him, she stopped shifting and looked at the bag in his hand. "More onions?" she asked. "Peppers." She considered this. "Can I help?" He set the bag down by the first bed, pulled out his trowel. "You know how to make a hole with your finger?" "Yes." "Then yes." She dropped to her knees on the paving stones immediately. No hesitation, no asking for cardboard or anything to kneel on. He noted that. The way she took discomfort as a given, didn't think to negotiate it. He pulled a second trowel from the bag, the small one, and handed it to her without comment. They worked. She made the holes too deep at first, and he showed her with 2 fingers. Not deep, just a notch, just enough to set the seed and cover it. She adjusted. She was quick to adjust. He placed seeds along the second row. She followed down the first, copying the spacing without being told. The door opened. Ven came through it with the specific energy of someone who had decided to get air and was committed to that version of events. She had a coffee in her hand, the shelter's disposable cups, thin cardboard, and she stopped just outside the door, looked at the yard, looked at Tiny, looked at Kai. Her expression didn't change. She walked to the bench against the far wall and sat down, legs stretched out, and drank her coffee. He kept working. So did Tiny. 3 minutes later, the door opened again, quieter this time. Aura came through it carrying a notebook, the cardboard cover worn soft at the corners. She didn't say anything to anyone. She sat at the opposite end of the bench from Ven, opened the notebook, and began to draw. No one said, "May I?" No one asked if this was all right. Kai registered that, didn't comment on it. He tore open the pepper envelope, tipped the seeds into his palm, small, pale, dry, and let Tiny pick them up one at a time with careful fingers. She placed each one with a focused deliberateness that reminded him of how some people carry full cups of water, aware of what spills. He covered the seeds behind her, firming the soil with the heel of his hand. From the bench, a pencil moved across paper. He caught the sound of it, a dry, soft scratch. "What do peppers look like?" Tiny asked. "At the start, like nothing. Little white threads. And then? Then leaves. Slow." She looked at the row they'd just covered. Smooth soil, no sign of anything. She pressed her palm flat against it, the way he'd shown her, gentle, just to close the contact between seed and dirt. Her hand was a quarter the size of his. "How long?" she asked. "Weeks." She absorbed that. He expected a protest, the way children often protested timelines. She just nodded once and moved to the next hole. Behind him, Ven's cup made a small sound against the bench. Set down, not thrown. He heard her shift her weight. He didn't turn around. Aura's pencil kept moving. He worked through the second envelope, then the third. The cold came and went in waves. The sun was there, but had no heat to it yet, just light, and the wall behind the bench caught it and held it slightly. That was probably why they'd both ended up on that bench, he thought, without thinking it consciously. The warmest spot in the yard on a cold morning. When the third row was covered, he sat back on his heels and looked at the beds. 3 rows now, even, dark, quiet. Nothing to see yet. The whole point of early spring planting was the act of faith involved. Doing the work now for something that wouldn't be visible for weeks. He'd explained that to himself a long time ago, and it had become just a fact, like most things that start as explanations and end as habit. He began collecting his tools. Tiny stayed where she was, kneeling by the bed, not helping him pack up, just staying, looking at the soil. "Will it grow?" she asked, not worried, just checking. "If we water it." She nodded. That seemed to settle something for her. He zipped the bag closed, stood up, felt the cold in his knees, moved his weight around to ease it. He glanced toward the bench, not with any particular intention, just the natural sweep of a person checking a space before they leave it. Ven was looking at him, not past him, not at Tiny, at him. Direct, steady, with that particular quality of attention that isn't curiosity so much as assessment. The way you look at something you haven't yet decided about. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. She just held it, and then looked back at the garden beds. Aura's notebook was open on her knee. She had her pencil lifted, paused, and she was looking at the beds too. Kai picked up his bag. "Same time Tuesday," he said, to no one in particular. Tiny's head came up. "We'll be here." He walked back to the gate. Behind him, the yard was quiet. The scratch of a pencil, the faint shift of someone on a bench, the cold that settled back in when the work was done. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew they were staying. Some people leave the moment the thing that kept them is finished, and some people stay a little longer than they need to, in a place that's not yet theirs, because something in it hasn't finished with them yet. He knew the difference. He'd been both at different points. He pulled the gate closed behind him and walked back to his bike. Marta caught him by the door. She was the shelter's Tuesday coordinator. Short, 50-something, with the permanent expression of someone managing more than the job description covered. She had a folder under her arm and a phone in her hand, and she stopped him in the narrow hallway on his way to the supply closet for the hose. "You've met the sisters?" she said. Not a question. "The girls in the yard, yes." Marta looked at her folder, not reading it, just looking at it, the way people look at things when they're deciding how much to say. "The eldest, Ven. She has a custody hearing in 3 weeks." She paused. "Guardianship, for the younger 2. Kai waited. "Without a permanent address, her chances are—" Marta stopped, made a small gesture with the folder. "The system isn't set up for someone her age. 22, no fixed residence, no employment record in this district. The judge will look at the file and see gaps." "What happens to the girls if it doesn't go through?" Marta's expression didn't change exactly. It just settled into something heavier. "They stay in the system, separately most likely, different placements." He stood with that for a moment. The hallway smelled of floor cleaner and old radiator heat. Somewhere above them, a door closed. "Does she know the odds?" he asked. "She knows enough." Marta looked at him directly. "I'm telling you because you're here, and you've been talking to them." Well, Tiny talks, but still. She tucked the folder tighter under her arm. "I'm not asking you to do anything. I just thought you should know." She walked back toward the office. He stood in the hallway another moment, then continued to the supply closet. He didn't think about it consciously at first. He filled the watering can, carried it out to the yard, and went through the Tuesday routine, checking the rows, loosening the soil at the edges where it had crusted overnight, pulling a weed that had appeared at the foot of the fence. His hands knew the work and did it. His head was somewhere else. 3 weeks. He did the math without meaning to. The peppers needed another 10 days before they'd be strong enough to separate. The onions were already showing the first pale thread of green at the crown. He'd noticed that morning before anyone came out. 6 weeks from the first frost date to the first real shoot. It happened the same way every time, regardless of whether you were watching. He pressed the soil around the onion crowns, firm but not tight. The custody system. He knew it from the inside. Not the legal side, not the paperwork, but the texture of it. The way a file could represent a person without resembling them. The way a judge looked at gaps and saw instability rather than circumstance. He'd had a social worker once, when he was 11, who'd said the words, "not an ideal placement," about a family he'd lived with for 8 months. A family that had, for those 8 months, been the closest thing to consistent he'd known. Not ideal. The words had the clean neutrality of a form checkbox. He didn't blame Marta for telling him. She hadn't asked him to fix it. She'd just handed him a fact and walked away, which was more honest than most people managed. He moved to the second row. The pepper rows showed nothing yet, just flat, dark soil, slightly damp from Tuesday's watering. You couldn't see anything happening. That didn't mean nothing was. The door opened behind him. He recognized Tiny's sneakers in his peripheral vision, the flash of pink at the heel, fainter than last week, the battery definitely going. She came and crouched beside the bed without preamble. "Did they sprout?" she asked. "The onions, yes. The peppers, not yet." She leaned in, inspecting the surface with the focused skepticism of a small scientist. "How do you know they're doing anything?" "I don't," he said. "But they usually do." She thought about that. What if they don't? Then we plant more. She sat back, satisfied with that. The logic of it, the absence of catastrophe in the answer. He handed her the small trowel, and she began the edge loosening he'd shown her, careful, focused, her braids falling forward over her shoulders. Ven came out 10 minutes later. She had her hands in the pockets of her jacket, and she stood at the usual spot, not quite in the yard, just past the door, and watched Tiny work. She didn't look at Kai directly. He didn't look at her either. They maintained a careful, mutual awareness of each other that was, he thought, more honest than pretending the other person wasn't there. He worked through the rows. The watering can made its slow sound. Tiny found a worm and examined it with great seriousness before setting it back. Kai's mind kept returning to the number. 3 weeks. And behind the number, a 22-year-old who'd come out of foster care and kept her sisters together through the end of it, and was now standing against a brick wall every Tuesday morning because she didn't know what else to do with the vigilance she'd built. He knew what that felt like. The hyper-awareness that had been useful once and didn't know how to shut off. He couldn't tell her he knew. That would require explaining how he knew, and she hadn't asked him anything. He covered the last edge, set the trowel down, picked up the watering can. He wasn't going to say anything. That was what he decided by the time he reached the fence end of the third row. It wasn't his place. Marta hadn't asked him to act on the information. She just passed it along, the way you describe weather to someone who's going to be outside anyway. He could hold it. Let her deal with her situation the way she'd been dealing with it. He turned the watering can over the onion row, slow and even. The first green thread caught the light, pale, almost white at the base, the exact color of something that has never seen the sun and is seeing it now for the first time. He kept his eyes on it and kept pouring, steady. He would come back on Friday. He would bring the next packet of seeds, leeks, maybe, or chard, something that liked the cold. He would work the rows. He would let Tiny help. He would let Ven stand by the wall for as many mornings as she needed to stand there. And he would think. He wasn't going to do nothing. He knew that about himself, had known it since he was 9 years old, and had watched a smaller boy in his third placement cry alone in the hallway, and had simply sat down next to him without a plan and without knowing what to do next. It hadn't been strategy. It hadn't even been kindness exactly. It had just been, someone is here and needs something, and I am also here. That had not changed. He set the empty can down. From the wall, Ven watched him. He could feel it. Not hostile, not warm. Measuring. The look of someone who has been disappointed enough times that they've started clocking the distance to the door before they've even sat down. He picked up his bag. 3 weeks was still 3 weeks. He had time to think. But he wasn't going to do nothing. The leeks arrived on Friday in a paper bag folded twice at the top. Kai set them on the edge of the bed and began with the onions first. They needed the soil lifted around the base just slightly to let the new growth breathe. The first green threads from Tuesday had straightened overnight into something more definite. Not tall, not impressive, just present, which was the whole point at this stage. Tiny appeared before he'd finished the first row. She came out at a half run and pulled up short at the bed's edge, looking at the onions the way she'd looked at the worm, that specific concentration, eyebrows drawn in. "They grew," she said. "A little." "Since Tuesday." "Since Tuesday." She crouched down and looked at the thread of green from close range, not touching. He'd shown her once. You don't pull, you don't press, you just look. And she'd remembered. She tilted her head. It's small. Everything starts small. She considered the shoots for another moment, then stood up and held out her hand for the small trowel. He gave it to her without comment. Ven came out 7 minutes later. She didn't go to the bench. She came farther into the yard than usual, stopped about 2 meters from the bed, close enough that the work was clearly visible, and crossed her arms. Not aggressive, just the posture of someone who has learned to take up the minimum possible space while still staying present. She watched Tiny work the edge of the second row with the small trowel. She watched Kai open the leek bag and begin sorting the seedlings by size. Nobody spoke for a while. The cold was different today. Less wet, more still. The kind of cold that sits cleanly in the air and doesn't move. The sun was on the south wall, and it held a faint warmth if you stood in it directly, which Ven wasn't, but Tiny had positioned herself in the strip of light without appearing to notice she'd done it. "Put your hands in the soil," Kai said. He said it to Tiny, who had been hovering the trowel over the bed without quite committing. "Don't be afraid of it." Tiny pressed both palms flat against the earth. She held them there. "It's cold," she said. "That's why the seed sprouts," he said. "Feels the warmth when it comes. Knows the difference." He hadn't planned to say it that way. It came out of the work, the rhythm of explaining things to someone who is actually listening. He went back to sorting the leeks, setting the stronger ones aside for the outer rows where the soil drained fastest. He felt Ven shift, not toward him, just a change in how she was standing. The crossed arms stayed, but something in the set of her shoulders moved. A small, internal adjustment. He didn't look up. He sorted the next seedling, checked the root, set it down. Tiny was pressing soil around the base of an onion shoot with 2 fingers now, slow, the way he'd shown her. She had dirt under her nails and a smear across her left wrist that she hadn't noticed. She was humming something low. He couldn't make out what, just the pitch of it, a private sound. "Are these going to be ready before we leave?" she asked. The question landed simply, the way children land difficult questions, with no sense that they're difficult. He looked at the onions. They'd need another 6 weeks, minimum, before they were worth pulling. He knew what Marta had said about the hearing. He knew the timeline. "Some things you plant for the people who come after," he said. Tiny thought about that. "That's sad," she said. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes it's just how gardens work." She nodded, not convinced, but accepting the information. She moved to the next shoot. From behind him, Ven spoke. It was the first time she'd said anything in the yard. Not to him, not to Tiny. Just out into the cold air. "Which ones are the leeks?" He held one up without turning. Slender, pale green at the tip, the roots still trailing dark soil. She didn't respond. He set it back down and began making the row of holes. "Deeper than the onions," he said, not specifically to her. "They grow down first." He heard her move. Not away, closer. A step, maybe 2. He kept making holes, evenly spaced, the right depth. She stopped where she was and didn't come further, but she was close enough now that he could see her boots in his peripheral vision. Thick soles, worn at the outside edge. He placed the first leek, firmed the soil. Tiny had moved to his other side and was watching the leek placement with the serious attention she gave all technical operations. "Why do they grow down first?" she asked. "Putting the root in before the shoot," he said. "More stable." She nodded as if this were advice, not botany. He placed the second leek, the third. Ven hadn't moved from where she'd stopped, and she hadn't gone back to the wall either. And he didn't comment on any of it. He just worked the row, steady. The soil was cold enough that his fingers went numb by the second half of the row. He switched the trowel to his left hand and pressed the right briefly against his thigh to warm it. A practical adjustment, nothing dramatic. Tiny saw it and wordlessly moved slightly closer on his right side, not touching, just close, the way animals move toward warmth without making it a statement. He placed the last leek. The row held 7. 3 onion varieties on the left, 4 leeks on the right, the whole bed now carrying something intentional, something that hadn't been there in January. He sat back and looked at it. Ven was looking at it too. He could see her face at this angle, not clearly, just the line of her jaw and the downward pull of her gaze, the scar on her upper lip, the 3 small earrings catching the flat winter light. She was looking at the bed the way you look at something you weren't expecting to have a response to. He picked up the watering can. He didn't say anything. He watered the row, slow and even, and the smell came up from the soil. That green, raw smell of wet earth warming just barely at the surface. Tiny put her palm flat against the soil again beside a leek stem, checking. Ven stood there for another minute. Then she picked up the paper bag that had held the leeks, folded it, and set it on the edge of the bed, not throwing it, not dropping it, setting it down neatly. Nobody said anything about it. He finished watering, set the can down. The bag sat on the edge of the bed, folded, placed there by a person who'd crossed the yard she'd been watching from for 2 weeks and come close enough to touch the work. That was all. That was enough. Things don't change in declarations. They change in the moment someone moves 2 steps closer than they've been standing and picks up a piece of trash and sets it down carefully, And that's all it is. And it's everything. She found him on Tuesday before he reached the gate. He was coming up the side path, bag on his shoulder, when Ven stepped out from the building's side entrance and stopped in front of him. Not blocking, just present, in the way that made it clear this wasn't an accident. She had her jacket on, the denim one, and her hands were in her pockets. She looked like someone who had decided something and was following through before she could decide otherwise. "You talked to Marta," she said. Not a question. He didn't treat it like one. "Marta talked to me." Ven looked at him steadily. The steel-gray eyes didn't waver, didn't soften. They did the same thing they always did in the yard, measured, calculated, found the distance to the door. She had no right to do that. "Maybe not," he said. A pause. The side path was narrow, and the cold came off the brick wall beside them in a flat, steady press. She was half a head taller than him, and broader in the shoulders than her jacket suggested. And she held the height without using it, which he'd noticed before. She didn't lean into the physical fact of herself the way some people did. "So now you know," she said. "Now I know." "And?" The word came out clipped, not aggressive, controlled. The voice of someone who has learned to cut sentences short, because the longer they run, the more they reveal. He shifted the bag on his shoulder. "And nothing. Unless you want it to be something." She looked at him. He looked back. The wind moved a piece of loose plastic along the far end of the path, and it scraped against the fence and was quiet. "Are you going to get involved," she said, "in something that isn't your business?" "No," he said. He let that sit for a moment. "Unless you ask." The pause that followed was the kind that has weight. Not empty. Full. Pressing on both sides. She was doing something with it, he could see that. Working through the sentence the way you work a knot you don't want to pull too hard. He kept his hands where they were, and his face neutral, and waited. She had lived in the foster system for 3 years, with 2 sisters to track and protect. He knew, without her telling him, what that had required. Not the details, the shape of it, the hyper-vigilance. The constant reading of rooms, of adults, of the gap between what people said and what they did next. She would have developed by now a very accurate internal instrument for detecting when someone was offering help as a way of accumulating leverage. He didn't know how to prove he wasn't doing that. He wasn't sure proof was possible. He just knew that the sentence he'd said was the true one, that he wouldn't move without being asked, and that he'd mean it, and that there was nothing else he could offer except the fact of continuing to show up on Tuesdays and Fridays and plant things in the cold. Ven looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him, at the gate, at the street beyond it. Her jaw shifted slightly. Not anger, just the working of something through. Her right hand came out of her pocket, and she pulled a ring off her index finger, turned it once, put it back on. A small, private gesture that he didn't think she knew she was making. "Why does it matter to you?" she said, still not looking at him. "We're not your problem." He thought about answering that carefully. Then he decided against careful. It doesn't have to be a problem for it to matter. She looked back at him. He held it, didn't add to it. She was waiting for the next sentence, the one where he explained himself, justified the position, filled the silence with the kind of reassuring noise that people made when they wanted to be trusted. He'd heard it enough times growing up to know its texture. It always sounded like something, and it always turned out to be very little. He didn't say the next sentence. She held the look another moment. Her expression hadn't changed, not exactly, but something in it had shifted. The same small degree that her position had shifted in the yard when he'd said the thing about seeds and warmth. A degree that wouldn't be visible to anyone who hadn't been watching carefully, and that was therefore only real to the 2 of them. "I'll think about whether I need anything," she said. He nodded once. "Okay." She stepped to the side, clearing the path. He moved past her toward the gate. He didn't look back, not because it would have been wrong to, but because it wasn't necessary. She'd said what she'd come to say, and he'd said what he had to say, and the rest of it was hers to do with what she needed. He opened the gate and let himself into the yard. The beds were quiet in the early light, the soil still dark from Friday's watering, the leek tips showing green against the brown. The onion shoots had grown another centimeter. He could see it from here, that incremental push upward that happened overnight, invisibly, without assistance. He set his bag down, pulled out the trowel. Tiny wasn't out yet. The yard was empty, just him and the cold and the beds and the sound of the city coming over the fence. He started on the edges of the third row, loosening the crust that formed when soil dried after watering, giving the roots room to move down. He worked, and he didn't let himself think too far ahead. And the onions kept growing in the particular patient way that things grow when no one is watching, not caring whether anyone sees it, not waiting for permission. Have you ever been somewhere that wasn't yours? A place, a situation, a moment someone else made, and stayed in it anyway because something in you simply couldn't walk away? Not because you're brave, not because you're good, just because you couldn't do otherwise. If that hits something in you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories here. Quiet ones, like this. Ora was already in the yard when he arrived on Friday. Not on the bench, on the ground, back against the wall under the south-facing window, knees drawn up, notebook open across her thighs. She had a pencil in her hand and another one tucked behind her ear, and she was working with the focused stillness of someone who had been at it for a while. Her thick hair had come loose from one of the buns, and she hadn't fixed it. Kai came through the gate, set his bag down, and began checking the beds. The leeks had pushed up another half-centimeter. The onion shoots were thickening at the base, still pale, but less fragile than last week. He pressed 2 fingers into the soil between rows. Still cold at depth, but the surface had a different feel now, a degree of give that hadn't been there in the first week. The frost was loosening its hold, slowly, without announcement. Ora didn't look up from her notebook. He watered the first row. The can made its steady sound, and the smell came up, wet soil and the faint green sharpness of the onion crowns. He worked without hurrying. The yard was quiet today, just the pencil moving and the water falling, and somewhere in the building above them, the muffled sound of a television. He was halfway through the second row when she spoke. "Do you want to see something?" He looked over. She was holding the notebook out, not toward him exactly, just angled away from her body, the way you offer something when you're not sure you want to take it. He set the watering can down and crossed the yard. The drawing was not what he expected. It wasn't the garden. It wasn't any of them. It was a house, small, low-roofed, with a specific kind of window that had a crack running through the lower left pane. A tree in front. Not decorative, just present. The kind that grows because nothing stopped it. A step at the door with a chip out of the left corner. She had drawn it from memory, clearly. Every line had the quality of something reconstructed rather than observed, the precision of someone who has gone over a thing many times in the dark. He looked at it for a moment. "Where is this?" "Was," she said. She took the notebook back, not quickly, just took it, closed it over the drawing. He went back to the watering can. "I draw to remember," she said. He wasn't sure if it was to him or just out loud. He treated it like it was to him. "What do you remember best?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. She opened the notebook again, but didn't draw, just held it. "The smell," she said. "There was a smell in the kitchen. Something my mother cooked." She paused. "I can't remember what it was. Just the smell. He stood with that. The pencil set itself flat against the page. Outside the fence, a truck went past, and the sound of it rolled over the yard and faded. He thought about what to say and came up empty, and decided that was fine. That empty was better than filling the space with something approximate. "The garden has a smell," he said after a while. She looked up, not at him, at the beds. "In summer," he said, "when the soil's warm. Different from now." She considered the beds with the same attention she gave her drawings, looking at what was there and also at what wasn't yet. He'd seen her do it with the yard before, through the window, when she thought no one was watching. The way her eyes moved differently from most people's, finding angles. She opened the notebook to a new page. He went back to watering. The third row, slow and even. The leek stems caught the water and let it run down to the base. He was nearly done when he heard the pencil begin to move again. A different rhythm than before. Faster, less deliberate. Working from something live rather than memory. He didn't look over. He finished the row, capped the can, checked the soil at the bed's edge. The drawing sounds continued. The dry scratch of pencil on paper, a pause, 2 short strokes. He pulled a small weed from the border of the path without thinking about it, pressed the soil back into place. When he straightened, he glanced toward her. She had the notebook angled slightly away, the automatic privacy of someone used to working unseen. But from this angle, standing, he could see the edge of the page. The lines on it were the beds, the 3 rows, the fence, the bench, the rough outline of someone kneeling, working, hands in the soil. He looked away before she noticed. He began packing his tools, slow and quiet, not making more sound than necessary. The pencil kept moving. He folded the empty seed packets, put them in his pocket, zipped the bag. The drawing sound continued. He sat down on the bench to tighten his lace, which had been loose since the gate. The cold of the bench came through his jacket immediately, and he took a second longer than the lace required, not for any particular reason. "What's the smell now?" Ora asked. She was still drawing. He thought about it. "Wet soil," he said. "Cold. A little like metal." He paused. "It changes in a few weeks, gets greener." She made a sound that wasn't yes or no. Her pencil moved. "Will you be here in a few weeks?" she asked. He looked at the beds, the onion shoots, the leeks. "Tuesday and Friday," he said. She didn't respond to that. She drew for another minute, and he sat on the bench in the cold, and the pencil moved across the paper, and neither of them said anything else. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who had found, without discussing it, that they could occupy the same space without it costing anything. Some people you explain yourself to. Some people you just exist near, and the existing is enough, and it asks nothing, and that is its own kind of answer. He stood up when the pencil stopped. She had closed the notebook and was looking at the beds. Her dark eyes moved across the rows the way they moved across a page, taking inventory, finding the structure in it. He picked up his bag. "Same time Tuesday," he said. She nodded once, tucked the pencil behind her ear where it joined the other one, and looked back at the garden. He let himself out through the gate. He found out by accident. He was dropping off the watering can at the supply closet on Tuesday morning when he passed the staff room and caught a fragment of conversation through the half-open door. 2 workers, voices low, and the words, "3 days," and "the little one," and "won't come out." He stopped in the hallway. Through the gap he could see the edge of a table, a coffee cup, a hand. He stood there long enough to understand the shape of it. Tiny hadn't been to the shelter's kindergarten group in 3 days. Something had happened with the other children. Nobody was saying exactly what, but the words conflict and difficult came up, and he knew how those words got used about children who were tired and scared and had stopped having the energy to perform calm. He stood in the hallway after the voices moved on. He looked at the supply closet door. Then he looked toward the stairs. He had never been inside the building. He came, he worked the garden, he left. That was the arrangement. Not spoken, just understood. The natural boundary of what he was and what the shelter was and what the sisters had allowed him to be so far. The yard was neutral ground. The building was theirs. He stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment. Then he went back to the supply closet, picked up his bag, and went out to the yard. He worked the beds alone for 20 minutes. The soil was warmer today. Not warm, but warmer, a degree of give that hadn't been there last week. The onion shoots had multiplied, a whole row of pale green threads now, thickening at the base. The leeks were pushing up steadily, indifferent to everything. He loosened the edges, watered, checked the drainage at the corner post. He did it all without the satisfaction it usually carried. Ven came out at 9. She stood at the door and looked at the yard, and looked at him, and didn't come further. He kept working. After a minute she came to the edge of the beds, not the wall, not the bench, the beds, closer than she'd been standing a week ago. "She's not coming out," Ven said. Not to him specifically. Just said it. He kept his eyes on the soil. "I heard." A pause. Ven's boots were still at the edge of the bed. He could hear her breathing, slow and controlled, the breathing of someone holding something down. "She'll be fine," Ven said. "The way people say things they're telling themselves." He sat back on his heels, looked at the onion row. "What happened with the other kids?" Ven was quiet for a moment. "She took something, a pencil case. She says she found it." A pause. "She probably did find it. But they said she took it, and she didn't explain herself, and it went from there." He nodded. "She doesn't explain herself when she thinks no one will believe her anyway," Ven said. The words came out flat, without heat, which made them heavier. He understood that. He'd been that child once, not with a pencil case, but with other things. The particular economy of silence that develops when you've learned that explanation costs more than it returns. He picked up his bag, zipped it, stood up. Ven looked at him. Something in her face asked a question she didn't say out loud. "I'm going to go in," he said. "If that's all right." She looked at him for a long moment. The steel eyes did their measuring, their calculation. He waited and didn't push, and didn't soften it with reassurance. Either it was all right, or it wasn't. She stepped back from the bed. Not a yes, not a refusal. A space. He took it. The building smelled of floor cleaner, and radiator heat, and the particular staleness of indoor air that doesn't move much. The stairs were narrow, the carpet worn to bare thread in the center of each step. He went up one floor, checked the room numbers on the doors, found the right one. 63, with a small dry erase board on it that had a drawing of a frog on it in green marker. He knocked twice. Quiet. Nothing. He knocked again. "Tiny, it's Kai." A long pause. Then from inside, "What?" Not "what do you want," just "what?" The voice of someone who has been in a room alone for 3 days and has stopped moderating their tone. "I brought something for the room," he said. Another pause. "What is it?" He looked down at the paper bag in his hand. He'd stopped at the hardware store on his route that morning, before the shelter. He'd told himself it was an instinct, just in case, not a plan. "Seeds," he said, "for a pot. You can grow them inside." The silence on the other side of the door had a different quality now. He waited. The door opened 4 inches. One amber eye looked up at him through the gap. Her braids were loose on one side, the elastic bands missing. She had a streak of something green on her forearm. Marker, probably, from the frog on the board. He held up the paper bag. She looked at it, then at him. The door opened another 4 inches. She was in a room with 2 bunk beds, a narrow window, a small desk with a surface covered in drawings. Auras, he recognized the style. A pot of pencils. A frog-shaped backpack hung on the bedpost. The room smelled of sleep and marker, and the particular close air of a space where someone has been spending too much time. He came in and sat on the floor with his back against the desk, the way he'd learned to sit in small rooms, low, unthreatening, at her level. She stood in the middle of the floor and looked at him. He put the bag between them. She sat down cross-legged and opened it. Inside, a small terracotta pot, a packet of soil, 3 seed packets, cress, radishes, and something small he'd added at the last moment that the store owner had said grew fast and always. She looked at the packets, read the labels slowly, her lips moving. "How long?" she asked. "Cress, 5 days," he said. "Radishes, 10. You water them every morning." She picked up the cress packet and turned it over. Her hands were smaller than the pot. She had a bandage on her right knee, fresh, white. "We can't go out," she said. "That's why these are for inside," he said. She set the cress packet down, picked it up again. She wasn't looking at him, looking at the packet, at the image on the front, at the small printed instructions in a font sized for adults. He didn't say anything about the pencil case. He didn't say anything about the other children, or the 3 days, or the things that had been said. She knew all of that. It didn't need to be put back into the air. He showed her how to fill the pot. A little gravel at the bottom if you had it, soil to 3 fingers from the top, press it flat but not hard. She didn't have gravel, so he showed her the alternative. A double layer of soil, compacted gently, which drained nearly as well if you didn't overwater. She pressed the soil down with her palm, then looked at him. "Like the garden," she said. "Like the garden," he said. She tipped the cress seeds onto her palm, tiny, dark, a dozen of them, and scattered them across the surface. Not evenly, but that was fine. She covered them with a thin layer of soil and pressed it down with 2 fingers. He moved to sit on the edge of the lower bunk, giving her the floor and the pot the way you give a child the center of the work. She set the pot on the desk next to the pencil cup and looked at it. Behind him, from the direction of the open door, he felt the specific change in air that meant someone was standing there. He didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Tiny and the pot. She picked up the cress packet and read the back of it again, her lips moving. Then she set it down next to the pot, neatly, the way she'd seen him set the trowel down next to the beds. In the doorway, Ven said nothing. The room held the 3 of them, and the small pot and the seeds underneath the soil, and nobody said anything at all, and it was enough. The lawyer's name was Denit. Kai had met him 3 years ago through the shelter's volunteer network. A small, patient man who did pro bono family law on Wednesday afternoons out of an office above a dry-cleaning shop 2 streets over. They'd never worked on anything together, just shared a table at the volunteer briefings twice a year. Dennett remembered faces. When Kai had called on Thursday, he'd said, "the gardener," before Kai had said his name. He hadn't told Dennett everything. He described the situation in general terms. An adult sibling, 2 younger sisters in her care, custody hearing coming up, no fixed address. Dennett had listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened, as if the silence he kept was itself useful information. "What's the hearing date?" Dennett had asked. Kai told him. A pause. He heard paper moving. "It's tight," Denise said, "but there's a mechanism." If she can demonstrate a stable, temporary residence, officially registered, not just a verbal arrangement, the court can grant a postponement to allow time for a more permanent address to be established. He paused again. It's not a win. It's more time. How long? 3 months, if the judge agrees. Maybe 4. Kai had sat with that in the hallway of his apartment building, his courier bag still on his shoulder, the phone against his ear. 3 months was not a solution. It was a window. But he knew better than most what a window meant when you'd been living without one. He thanked Denise and said he'd be in touch. He hadn't slept particularly well that night. Ven was in the yard on Tuesday morning before he arrived. She was standing by the bed, not watching the gate, just standing there, looking at the onion shoots. She had her jacket on and her hands in her pockets, and she wasn't doing anything, just standing in the yard, the way people stand in a room they're about to leave. He came through the gate, and she turned. He set his bag down, crouched to check the soil. The temperature had shifted overnight, warmer by several degrees, finally, the kind of change that didn't reverse itself. The soil at the surface had dried slightly, which meant the roots were drinking. The onion crowns had pushed up another centimeter while he wasn't looking. He pressed his thumb into the earth between 2 shoots, checking depth. Good. The frost was done, he thought. Or almost. He began watering the first row. "You've been thinking," Ven said. He glanced up. She was watching him with the direct attention she gave to things she decided to engage with, which was never accidental. He moved the watering can along the row. "I talked to a lawyer I know," he said, informally. Her chin came up slightly. Not alarm, something more careful than that. The posture of someone receiving information they've been waiting for but aren't sure they want. "He does family law," Kai said. He kept the watering steady, not looking at her, giving her room. He said, "There's a mechanism. If you have a registered address, temporary but official, the court can grant a postponement. Gives you time to find something permanent." Silence. He moved to the second row. "How temporary," she said. "Officially temporary. Someone registers their address as your temporary residence. Signs a statement. Denise, the lawyer, can draw it up. It's a real document." The watering can reached the end of the row. He straightened and finally looked at her. Her face was doing several things at once, all of them small, all of them controlled, the way a person controls things when they've learned that showing the full version of any feeling is a liability. She was looking at the beds, not at him. Her jaw was set. A ring turned once on her finger and stopped. He waited. He had gone over this the night before, in the particular way he went over difficult things, not planning what to say so much as understanding what it would cost her to hear it. She had built her entire operating system around not needing anything from people she didn't know, around not being in debt to anyone, not giving anyone the kind of hold that came from accepting help. He knew that system. He'd run it himself for years, until he'd understood that it kept him safe and also kept him empty, and that the two things were connected. He wasn't going to tell her that. She didn't need his history. She needed the offer. "I have an address," he said, "officially. If you need it as a temporary registration, I can do that." Ven looked at him. The look was not like her other looks. Not the measuring from across the yard, not the watchful stillness by the wall. This was something more direct and more exposed and more dangerous for her. He could see that. The look of someone standing at an edge they hadn't expected to reach today. "Why do you need this?" she said. The question landed flat and clean, with no particular anger in it. She wasn't accusing. She was asking the thing she needed to ask, the thing that every version of help she'd ever received had carried underneath it, like a hook in bait. "What do you get? What does this cost me? What are you going to do with it later?" He held the watering can at his side and looked back at her. The yard was quiet. Somewhere in the building a window opened and then closed again. The onion shoots moved slightly in a breath of wind. He knew the answer. He'd known it since Marta's hallway, since the first Tuesday, since the moment a 22-year-old with her arms crossed had come into a cold yard and stood against a wall rather than pulling her little sister back inside. He'd known it the way you know things that don't require explanation, only honesty. He said, "I'll tell you, but it's going to take a minute." Ven looked at him for a long moment. The ring was still on her finger. Her boots were planted in the soil at the bed's edge, the way they always were when she decided to stay somewhere. She didn't move. He didn't sit down. Neither did she. They stood by the bed in the cold yard, him with the empty watering can at his side, her with her hands back in her pockets, and he told her the thing he almost never told anyone because it didn't come out right when he tried, and he'd mostly stopped trying. "I was in foster care," he said, "from when I was 4. 7 families before I was 18. He said it the way you say a fact that used to be a wound and has become, over time, just a measurement. Not painless, just dimensioned. Something you can hold without dropping." Ven didn't move. Not bad families, most of them. That's the part people don't expect. He looked at the onion shoots, the row of them, pale and steady in the morning light. Some of them were fine. Some of them were good, even. But none of them were permanent. There was always a reason, a change in circumstances, a placement that made more sense. Something. He pressed his boot against the edge of the bed frame, a gentle pressure, something to do with his feet. You learn, after a while, to not fully unpack, to leave some things in the bag, because the bag's going to move again. Ven was looking at the beds. He couldn't see her face from this angle, just the line of her jaw and the straight fall of her black hair. She was listening the way she did everything, fully and without signaling it. "I volunteer here because everyone in this building is doing the same thing," he said. "Keeping the bag packed, not because they want to, because they've had to." He paused. "I don't tell them that. It's not useful. I just come and plant things." He stopped. The yard held the silence without difficulty. Somewhere on the street beyond the fence, a bus moved past, and the sound of it came over the wall and dissolved. "I've never had an address that felt like mine," he said. "I have one now. I have had it for 4 years. It's a rented room in a building with a broken elevator, and the heating cuts out twice a winter. And I've painted the wall by the window a color the landlord would hate if he noticed." He said it simply, without performance. "But it's mine. My name's on the contract. Nobody can reassign it." He looked at the onions. "That's what I mean when I say I have an address. It means something to me, so I know what it means to not have one." Ven said nothing. He'd finished. He hadn't planned it to be that long or that specific, but once it had started, it had found its own length, and he let it. The cold was present, but not sharp today. The sky had a thin, white quality, not quite overcast, not quite clear, the kind of sky that precedes warmth by a week. He looked at the beds, the work of the past several weeks laid out in rows, the onions with their crowded shoots, the leeks pushing steadily, the pepper row still low but definite. He heard Ven shift her weight. 7, she said. 7. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had the same flat control it always had. But something underneath it had changed in register. Not softened, exactly, but shifted. The way a note changes when you press a different key. "We were in care for 3 years, she said. Together. That was the part I held on to, that they didn't separate us." He didn't fill the space. "I used to think—" She stopped, started again. I used to count the weeks in the first placement. Count them. Like, if I got to a certain number, something would be decided. A pause. Nothing gets decided by counting. No, he said. She crossed her arms, the old posture, the wall. But it looked different today. Not a barrier, more like something she held herself with, the way you hold your own arms when you're cold and there's nothing else to hold. I'm 22, she said. I have 3 earrings and a leather choker, and I look like someone you crossed the street for. And I've been in this yard every Tuesday for 3 weeks, watching you put things in the ground. She said it without irony, without bitterness, just inventory. I don't know what that makes me. He thought about it. Someone who stayed, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. The air between them had changed. Not warmer, exactly, but less defended. The distance was the same, but it had a different quality now. The way a room feels different after the window's been opened, even after you close it again. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded. I'm not saying yes, she said. I know. I'm not saying no, either. She uncrossed her arms and put her hands back in her pockets, the precise economy of her movements back in place. She looked at the beds one more time, the whole of them, the full 3 rows, the weeks of work visible in the soil. Her eyes moved across it the way Aura's eyes moved across a drawing, finding the structure. The onions are doing well, she said. He looked at them. Another month, maybe less. She nodded once. Then she turned and walked back to the door, her boots steady on the paving stones, her back straight, her hands in her pockets. She opened the door and went in without looking back. He stood in the yard for a moment. The chutes were still there. The leeks. The rows he'd laid down in cold ground weeks ago, before any of this. Before Tiny and the seeds in the pot. Before Aura and the drawing of a house that no longer existed. Before a woman with steel eyes had stepped off a wall and crossed a yard and picked up a paper bag and folded it and put it down. He picked up the watering can. There were things you couldn't plant with an outcome in mind. You put them in, you watered them, you came back. The soil did the rest. Or it didn't. But you came back. That was the only part you controlled. The hearing was postponed. Denise called Kai on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the paperwork had gone through, while Kai was locking his bike outside a delivery address 3 streets from the shelter. The judge accepted the temporary registration, Denise said. Postponed 4 months, pending demonstration of stable circumstances. A pause. It's not a resolution. I know, Kai said. 4 months is workable, if they move quickly on the housing application. Okay. The lawyer representing the guardianship office will push back at the next hearing. She needs to have something concrete by then. I'll tell her. He locked the bike, made the delivery, and rode the long way back past the shelter without stopping. He needed a day before he said anything to anyone. He needed to let it be what it was. Not a victory, not a solution, just a door that had been closed and was now open by 4 months. He knew the difference. He'd been on the other side of enough closed doors to know that open didn't mean safe. It meant possible. He told Ven on Friday. She was in the yard before him again. She'd started doing that, arriving before he came through the gate, standing by the beds, not waiting for him exactly, but present when he arrived. He didn't comment on it. He came through the gate and she turned, and he told her what Denise had said in the same plain sequence he'd heard it. She listened without moving. When he finished, she looked at the beds for a long moment, and he let her look, and said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say that was his to say. 4 months, she said. 4 months. She nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing a measurement, fitting it against the other measurements she carried. Then she said, "We're moving to the transitional housing next week. They found a placement." She paused. 2 rooms. The 3 of us. He looked at the beds. The onion shoots had spread into a full row of green now, no longer pale, no longer tentative. Real color, the dense green of something that had established itself. The leeks were 20 centimeters tall. The peppers had finally broken the surface in the far row, small and definite. The first leaves splitting the soil in the unhurried way that things emerged when they were ready. "That's good," he said. "It's temporary," she said. "Most things start that way." She was quiet. He crouched by the onion row and pressed his thumb into the soil. Warm at the surface now. Warm enough. The frost was gone. It had left while he wasn't watching, which was how it always went. He began the last maintenance of the season's first planting, checking the bases, removing the few shoots that had come in too close together, giving the strongest ones room. Tiny work. Necessary. Ven crouched beside him. He registered it without reacting. She had never crouched by the beds before, always stood, always kept the upright distance. She crouched with her elbows on her knees and looked at the row from close range, the way Tiny looked at things, the way Aura looked at a drawing she was still deciding about. She reached out and touched the top of an onion shoot. 1 finger. Light. Checking something. "Aura wants to draw the garden before we go," she said. "She can come any morning." "She'll come tomorrow, probably." Ven withdrew her hand. "Tiny wants to take the pot." "The cress should be ready by now," he said. "She can eat it first if she wants." "Then take the pot." Ven made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, something shorter, something that lived just at the edge of one. He hadn't heard that from her before. It was a small sound, and it was over quickly, and she didn't comment on it. He worked the row. She stayed crouched beside him, not helping, not interfering, just present in the way she'd been present from the beginning, watching, measuring, deciding what things were before she responded to them. Only she was closer now. The wall was not a wall anymore. It was just a wall. After a while, she said, "Why do you plant onions in a shelter garden?" He thought about it. It wasn't a challenge. It was a real question. "Onions come back," he said. "You plant them once, and if you leave the bulb, they come back the next year. Someone else's garden, doesn't matter. They don't need you to come back for them to come back." She looked at the row. He could see her processing it, not the botany of it, the other thing. "Even if no one waters them," she said. "They prefer water," he said, "but they manage." She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up, slowly, brushing the soil from her knee with 2 flat strokes, and looked at the full length of the bed, the onions, the leeks, the new peppers in the far row, the whole of what the cold ground had been holding since February. He stood up beside her. They were both looking down. Her shoulder was a foot above his. Her boots were at the bed's edge, his sneakers beside them, the worn left toe almost touching the wooden frame. The bed smelled of warm soil and green things, and the particular living smell of a garden in the moment it has decided to become itself. "It sprouted," Ven said. He looked at the onions. The row of them, full and green, present in the way that things are present when they've come through something and arrived on the other side. "It sprouted," he said. Neither of them moved. The sun came over the south wall at the angle it reached now, in the 2nd week of March, hitting the beds directly for the first time since October. The green caught it and held it. The soil took it in. Somewhere in the building, a door opened, and Tiny's sneakers flashed pink on the stairs, the battery somehow still going, and her voice carried through the window before she reached the yard. "Is it ready? Is it ready? Can I eat it?" And behind her, quieter, the sound of Aura's feet, and the soft knock of a notebook against a door frame. Ven didn't turn around yet. She looked at the beds one more time. Then she turned, and Tiny burst through the door and into the yard, braids flying, bandaged knee and all, and the morning held all four of them at once, the girl running to the garden, the artist in the doorway already reaching for her pencil, the woman who had stood against a wall for 3 weeks and was now standing beside it, and the man who had come on a Tuesday in February with a bag of onion sets and no particular plan except to put them in the ground and come back. Nothing was resolved. 4 months was not forever. 2 rooms in transitional housing was not a home. But the shoots were green, the soil was warm, and some things, once they've come up through the dark, don't go back down. Have you ever done something small, something that cost you almost nothing, that turned out to matter more than you knew? Not a grand gesture, just you stayed. You came back. You kept showing up. If this story reached something in you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories here about small choices and what grows from them,